Okay, so today we're going to do more on relevance, basically. We're going to do fallacies, essentially, because of the thing that I said at the end of class on Tuesday, which was that probably there's not a general formula for determining what's relevant. Probably that's a judgment you always have to make in a context, using common sense, using your intuition, and kind of like human faculties. So it's not a helpful thing to say, really. Probably you already knew that or guessed it. But nonetheless, it's helpful to acknowledge that that's the situation that we're in. So really, when you're talking about relevance, the fallacy approach is probably more helpful than the criterial approach. If you recall, the criterial approach is when you try to say what goes right in an argument, and the fallacies approach is where you say what goes wrong. So there's no general formula to say when you've got relevance right in anything but formal contexts. So if you want to know, what's the next winning move, what's the move I should make to win this game of tic-tac-toe, probably you can gather all of the relevant facts to make that determination, right? Like in a straightforward, well-defined problem-solving context, relevance is fairly easy to nail down, but in the weird and woolly world of informal reasoning, typically it's going to be much harder to pin down. So you really have to use essentially common sense to figure it out. So with that in mind, we're going to do this. We're going to go through another handful of fallacies today, talk about what makes something an instance of that fallacy and what makes something not an instance of that fallacy. Any questions before we start? Any kind of course material, kind of course questions? Everybody good? Okay. But just before we get into the fallacies stuff, I want to go back to this argument. I feel like we didn't nail this when we were trying to analyze it. We didn't cleanly get the structure that was like obviously a good one. So I want to go back through it. I did my own. So this morning I did my own analysis of it. And I want to show it to you and sort of see if you think it's reasonable. And then we can do the next few steps of argument analysis. I think we didn't do much of that on this. So we didn't really talk about acceptability, relevance, and adequacy. So I'll just show you how I thought a good way of breaking this down is, and you'll see it's a slightly different way than we did in class. And now we can do the sort of like analysis. So what I propose to do here, like the main moving part of this analysis is MP1. So I've helped myself to this really, not really complex, but like somewhat complex missing premise. It's a normative premise that says, if something is dangerous and there's no need for it or right to it, it should not be allowed. So that was the thing right at the end of our analysis last time. Sorry, what's your name? Alyssa. Alyssa gave us the missing key to this argument, which was somehow connecting, things not being right or things being dangerous to it shouldn't be allowed. And I think that was the key to try to connect a bunch of the parts of this argument, a bunch of the main moving parts of this argument to the conclusion. So I've kind of like elaborated that a little bit and tried to bring more parts into it. So if something is dangerous, there's no need for it or right to it, it should not be allowed. And I think that's the assumption made by this argument, right? So without that assumption, it's really hard to understand how you could connect things like, so they just claim like P1, there's no right to be killed. They don't support that with any argument. And it wasn't obvious how to connect that to people shouldn't be allowed to. Like, so saying that there's no right to it doesn't obviously lead to the conclusion you shouldn't be allowed. So assuming that this argument is making sense, there must be some connection which implies it's part of a missing premise or missing premises. Yeah? So like the strategy with something like this, I think working backwards from the conclusion. So that's how I did this. That's how I came up with this analysis. I said, okay, what's the conclusion? You get the conclusion. You say, okay, what connects directly to that? And if you find yourself saying, well, it looks like nothing connects directly to the conclusion, I can't figure out any premise that goes straight to that conclusion, then you've probably got either a missing premise or just an abysmally bad argument, right? If the argument is just catastrophically bad, there might be nothing that points to the conclusion, but assume, I'm not going to give you an argument that bad to analyze. The arguments will be at least have some semblance of argumentation about them. So probably there's going to be something to connect to the conclusion, and you should start your analysis. So you start your analysis first by reading the argument, and then identifying the conclusion, but the next step should be asking yourself, so work backwards from the conclusion is my recommendation. So ask yourself, how do I get to this conclusion? And then once you've got that, so this first line above the conclusion, then you can ask, okay, now how do all the other bits of the argument fit into that? So you're more or less trying to identify like major premises, like the most important premises are probably the ones that connect directly to the conclusion. And then everything else is just arguments for those major premises. This is the strategy I'd recommend, okay? Does this make sense to you? Does this way of breaking down the argument look reasonable enough? I hope so. So 3 major premises and a missing premise. There's no right to be killed, there's no need for it, and it's dangerous. I think those are the 3 major strands of argument. And then little bits and pieces were added in as evidence for those things. Like alternative treatments are available is evidence for there's no need. And you can imagine other pieces of evidence for that premise, right? Similarly, P5, 6, and 7, so it could lead to involuntary deaths. And evidence for that was, in the Netherlands in 1990, 1,000 people were killed without their request. So I take it that that's supposed to be evidence for it could lead to involuntary deaths, which is evidence for it's dangerous. And alternately, P7, doctors don't always report it, which I take it as another bit of evidence that it could be dangerous. That inference I'm not quite that sure about. Like maybe you need a missing premise there, like things that go unreported tend to be more dangerous or something like that. But that's how I would break it down. Okay. So if that all seems reasonable, now we move on to the next steps, asking about the acceptability of the premises as individuals and their relevance, and then the adequacy of the argument as a whole. So again, probably the best strategy is to start by thinking about the premises that lead directly to the conclusion, because if you find that there's a premise that leads directly to the conclusion that you find unacceptable, that's probably cut off a major part of the argument. In this case, the premises closest to the conclusion form one big dependent relation, as far as I can tell, right? So this missing premise I've helped myself is a conditional. If this, that, and the other thing, then it shouldn't be allowed. So that's just like a conditional with a 3-part antecedent, yeah? And the other 3 premises fill in that antecedent, which means that if any one of those premises turns out to be false, the whole argument collapses. Especially if you don't believe, if you don't believe that conditional, then the whole argument collapses, right? So what do you think of that conditional? In your actual opinion about actual life, what do you think that, do you think that's a good conditional, MP1 there? This is about your political views, I think. Like a libertarian would say, no, if something is dangerous and there's no need or right for it, should still be allowed. Let people make their own dumb mistakes, right? Like, I don't know. What do you think of MP1? If you were asked to assess this on your argument assessment, what would you say about it? Yeah. Good, yeah. Yeah, so a more defensible version of this would be, if something is dangerous to others, and there's no need and there's no right, then it shouldn't be allowed. That sounds reasonable, right? Like, you're not allowed to drive your car indefinitely fast because that's dangerous to others and there's no need and there's no right, so you shouldn't be allowed to do that? Yeah? That sounds plausible. Yeah?
Kind of an argument against, like, not euthanasia, but like forced or like non-chosen, because euthanasia is when you choose for yourself, that is not harming other people.
That's true. Okay, so this seems to be like it would be a better argument against involuntary euthanasia. But if it's true that, okay, so now I think what we're asking now is it true, is premise 3 true? So is it in fact the case that allowing euthanasia is dangerous? And the evidence that they marshaled for that was, look, people are getting involuntarily euthanized. I don't actually believe that. I haven't looked into it, to be honest, but I don't actually believe it is true that there are thousands of people being involuntarily euthanized. I think that's really bizarre. It's a really bizarre claim to make.
Would you report it as that you involuntarily euthanized someone?
I absolutely would not. If I killed somebody in a hospital that didn't want to be killed, I think I would keep that to myself. Yeah. But then,
maybe hard pressed to find proof then.
You would be hard-pressed to find proof, and the question is, how do you know? Like, how do they know that P6 is true? So in the Netherlands in 1990, in 1 year, 1,000 people were killed against their will under the guise of this program. That sounds like a lot, doesn't it? And furthermore, how did you get that number? Did somebody mark it off on the form like involuntary euthanasia, tick, and then they just put it in the public records or something like that? Like, how did you get that number if it's actually like there's a plague of people being killed against their will in these hospitals? It's bizarre that they would have accurate statistics about that, isn't it? Okay, so that would be what we're talking about, the acceptability of 6. Like, well, maybe, but really I want to see a study or something like that. So if I was assessing this in an argument assessment, I would say, that sounds really weird and implausible, and the article provides no evidence, so I would like to see a study. So I'm going to be very cautious about accepting P6. This is a case where, I told you, don't just doubt premises for the sake of doubting them, but in this case, it's really implausible to me that that's the case, right? So that's a reason for doubting the premise and then asking for more evidence. Yeah?
Play the devil's advocate for P6. Maybe the involuntary euthanasia was like the person that was killed did not actually give their consent, so their family or friends.
Right. Right, good. Okay, so yeah, the suggestion is maybe involuntary euthanasia means people who are unable to either consent or not consent anymore, and that it was a family decision. I'm not like, okay, so maybe that's, so plausible. I don't know what the medical system in the Netherlands is like, so that's what it would depend on. I assume that it's most like most other Western countries where bioethics sort of focuses on the rights of the individual. So individual has the right to refuse or consent to a medical decision regardless of what their family thinks. Not the case, for example, in Confucian philosophy, where the unit of individuality is more like the family, and that's the unit that makes the decisions. So it's a family-based consultation, and the family makes the medical decisions. So that could be the case in the Netherlands, maybe. I suspect that they're more like Western countries where it's the individual who decides. But that's that is a plausible, or it's a possibility for how P6 could be true. Okay. So yeah, okay. So any other premises that strike you as particularly dubious in this thing? Huh? Do you think people have no right to be killed? That's a tricky one, right? Who knows? Like, I don't know where rights come from, to be honest. Like, currently, the UN says that we have a right to the internet. Like, how did that come about? When did that become a right? It's mysterious. The ontology of rights are mysterious to me. Right and wrong makes more sense to me. So it is right that everybody has access to the internet, but I don't know what you mean by you say it's a right. So people have no right to be killed. Certainly there's no clause in our kind of general social contract that says you must have access to euthanasia if you want it. So if by right you just mean like thing that everybody agrees you should have, then that P1 is true. I think we doubted last time. In the little bit that we did talk about these premises before, we doubted P2, there's no need for euthanasia, supported by the idea that there are always alternative treatments available. Probably that's not true, right? Probably there are cases where somebody's in a lot of pain and there isn't an effective treatment, or the effective treatment is so effective that it makes you not able to be conscious anymore. Like, that's often the case. To treat the pain, you have to bring the person out of consciousness entirely, so you're not really living much anymore. Whew, man, this is a grim argument. Yeah?
Technically, people do have a right to be killed if they can deny, like, the right to necessitate, so, like,
Good.
choosing to be killed.
Good. So you can derive a right to be killed from the right to choose your own medical interventions. You say you have the right to refuse any medical intervention that you don't want, therefore you have a right to refuse life-saving medical intervention, something like that. Yeah, good, good. All right, so let's accept P1, P2 maybe, P3, like it's an open, I think your best bet on most of these is to say, look, it's an open question, more data is needed. Yeah, okay, So let's leave the acceptability of the premises there. Clearly mixed acceptability. Like, I don't think that you should just accept all of these premises just because they sound right to you. How about their relevance? Okay, so now forget everything that we just said. Forget everything about whether these things are true, and now ask yourself, if they were true, would they lead to the conclusion? So again, let's start from the bottom line, start from the premises that lead directly to the conclusion, and say, okay, does that bottom inference work? What do you think? Okay, so 2 questions. Does it work in general? And if it does work, is it a deductive argument or an inductive argument? This is your determination of how relevant the premises are to the conclusion. If it's an inductive argument, the premises can be relevant, but they haven't given you all of the possible relevant information. If it's a deductive argument, then if those premises are true, the conclusion follows necessarily. It's guaranteed to be true by the truth of the premises. So that's maximum degree of relevance, right? So I think this is a, yeah.
I think it's pretty deductively valid given missing premise 1 because we have premise 1, 2, 3.
Excellent,
And then
yeah.
if premise 1, 2, 3, then euthanasia should not be allowed.
Yeah, that's what you can tell. I think that's exactly right. I think it's a deductive argument because I really helped myself to exactly the missing premise that I wanted there, didn't I? I really tailored my missing premise to be just precisely what you would need to deductively entail the conclusion. So, you know, you have to commit, if you're going to do that, you have to sort of like make the premise pretty strong. Like MP1 is a pretty strong premise. It makes a strong claim about what should be the case. But once you've articulated that, it really leads quite directly to the conclusion, right? And it leads there in a deductive way. It's an if-then, you know, antecedent's true, therefore consequent. It's a kind of modus ponens. It actually is, because they're like modus ponens is typically if P then Q, P therefore Q. But P is a sentence, and P can have structure inside of itself. So this sentence, if A and B and C, therefore Q, is structurally similar. You could symbolize this as P. Right? Say if P then Q. So adding conjunctions in the antecedent doesn't change the structure of a modus ponens. So it's just saying this is just a really elaborate P. If A and B and C, then Q, A and B and C, therefore Q. Yeah? You could also put a conjunction in the consequent if you want. So Q could also have internal structure. It could also be like X and Y and Z. Yeah? Okay. So really it's just from the premises that lead directly to the conclusion is just a modus ponens with a conjunction in the antecedent. So it's a deductive argument. If those premises are all true, we don't think they're necessarily all true, but if they were, then the conclusion would be guaranteed. Now, I take it that the rest of the relations, so that's part of your assessment of relevance. So the premises that lead directly to the conclusion have the maximum degree of relevance, so that's good. P4 leading to P2, alternate treatments are available for pain, therefore there is no need for euthanasia. So if it was true that alternate treatments are always available for somebody in pain, does that entail, or to what degree does that raise the probability that there's no need for euthanasia? Yeah?
I don't think it fully qualifies because people wouldn't want to enter like only for pain. It could be something like a disability or
Good, right. So this, if pain was the only thing that people needed euthanasia for or wanted euthanasia for, then it would be fully relevant, right? So it would contain all of the relevant information. It's nonetheless relevant. Like it's not that it's irrelevant because it doesn't deductively entail the premise 2. It's relevant. It just doesn't include all of the potentially relevant facts. So if you're assessing the relevance of P4 for for P2, that's what you would say. You would say, look, pain is one of the factors here. Pain is one of the reasons why people want or need euthanasia, so it's relevant, but there are other factors, so it's not maximally relevant, right? It's not all of the relevant facts, it's just some of them. Yeah? So it's inductive, right? It should raise the probability, if P4 was true, it should raise the probability in your mind of P2, but it doesn't guarantee, the truth of P4 doesn't guarantee the truth of P2. I think we, probably that's, like, we can just, it would be the same story for P6, P5, and P7, right? I take it that those are all inductive relationships. Those are all things that would raise the probability of the conclusion or the sub-conclusion that they're aimed at, but none of them are just completely, you know, clean out the problem, say everything that's possibly important, like euthanasia could lead to involuntary deaths, therefore it's dangerous. Well, you might want more. You know, there might be other things that make it dangerous or not. Doctors do not always report euthanasia. Does that make it dangerous? Well, it might raise the probability that it's dangerous. But if they're not doing anything dangerous, like if they're not doing anything bad or unethical, but nonetheless not reporting it, that doesn't really make it dangerous. So again, you've been given facts. They're relevant facts. They're important facts to establishing the things that they're pointed at, but they're not all of the relevant facts. So there's something that you could say in reply to each of those inferences, right? So that's assessing relevance. Now, the adequacy of the argument as a whole. This is kind of your holistic judgment of how good an argument this is. And really, we should have had all the information that you need so far. All the information you need to determine the adequacy of an argument is your judgments about the acceptability of the premises and your judgments about their relevance. And you just do the multiplication. You just say, okay, were these premises acceptable? And in my opinion, they're like iffy, you know, iffy acceptability at best. MP1 is the one that I'm most worried about, to be honest. Like, you know, that's a really strong view about how society should be organized, and there's a massive debate about it, so, yeah. Now, of course, those premises, what we said was those major premises are fully relevant. So if there's an inadequacy here, it's mainly due to the unacceptability or the sort of like lack of full acceptability of those major premises, P1, P2, P3, and MP1. Yeah? And then you could say part of what contributes to the lack of perfect adequacy of the, or acceptability of the major premises are the inferential weakness of the connections between P4 to P7 and their subconclusions or their lack of acceptability. Yeah? Something like that. So I'm just really, I hope that sounded like we were just going over the same thing that we just talked about, like we're just kind of just rehashing what we said before, but showing how they interact, right? Showing the interaction between how adequate or how acceptable the premises were and how relevant they were. Yeah? That section can be very short in your argument analysis, unless there's extra bits you want to add in there, something about, you know, how convincing it, convincing is the wrong word. How rationally justified the inference is, or something like that. Convincing is a rhetorical term. It doesn't really apply here. Okay. So have we beaten this thing to death? Have we sufficiently subdued this argument? I think so. Okay, so let's move on. Unless there's any quick questions? No, okay, sick of that. I promise you'll never have to look at that argument again. Well, you might have to. Okay, so let's do some fallacies. I call these fallacies of relevance. I guess most fallacies are fallacies of relevance in the sense that relevance is about the relation between premises and conclusions, and all fallacies are errors in moving from premises to conclusions. So I tried to, last semester, I tried to split these up into fallacies of acceptability, relevance, and adequacy, but I think they're all just fallacies of relevance, to be honest. So today we'll do, these should be familiar to you. Well, maybe not should. Possibly these are familiar to you. They're really common to throw around, so I think it's helpful to go through them in detail. And again, the thing that I'm going to really harp on is how hard it is to tell whether some given bit of text is an actual fallacy or if it's an acceptable bit of reasoning. And once again, I think these are really badly taught in most cases, where they tell you that, oh, here's what this fallacy looks like, go get them. And anything that looks like that fallacy, people will like, it's an ad hominem, and they won't be able to explain why that was a problem. And that's what I want you to be able to do, is explain why the bit of reasoning was bad, rather than being able to identify something as a fallacy. So we'll do a appeal to authority, ad hominem, the balance fallacy, and the fallacy fallacy. Okay, so appeal to authority. Sometimes appealing to an authority to support a premise is perfectly legitimate. So saying that an expert said something is very often a perfectly legitimate way to introduce a premise, or to justify a premise. But equally often, people make illegitimate appeals to authority. So our job is to sort out what makes an appeal to authority legitimate or illegitimate. Again, I'm sorry that the names of these fallacies are like confusing, in the sense that if I say the fallacy appeal to authority, that means you've made an error. But if I say you appealed to authority, that doesn't mean you necessarily committed the fallacy. Like sometimes, because sometimes it's legitimate to appeal to authority. And very often it's some weird, ambiguous, confusing thing in between legitimate and illegitimate. And what I would like for you to do is be able to have that as a category in your head. Don't think that this has to be either one or the other. It can be just weird and ambiguous whether it is a legitimate or illegitimate appeal to authority. Okay, so let's go through some examples and hopefully bring this out. And each example, I'll throw you a couple of examples that I think are clear, either instances or not instances, and a couple of examples where I think it's genuinely ambiguous. So, Justin Trudeau, former math teacher, said that the internal angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. He's the expert, so you should believe him. It's true, he was a former math teacher. Okay. So is that a legitimate appeal to authority or an illegitimate appeal to authority? Is that a good inference? Is the fact that Justin Trudeau was a math teacher good reason to believe him about how many degrees are inside a triangle? No? Like, he's got the relevant expertise, right? He was a math teacher. I think that's actually not a bad appeal to authority. Now, yeah? All right. Here's another one. Justin Trudeau says that marijuana should be legalized. He's the expert. You should believe him. I mean, as not qua math teacher, but as prime minister, presumably he's an expert on which laws should be enacted, none more expert. But just for a little bit of context, don't consider this bit part of the argument, but a 2017 Angus Reid poll reported that 63% of Canadians supported legalization and 37% opposed it. Just for context, keeping that in mind. Okay, so back to this stuff in quotes, just considering the stuff in quotes. Justin Trudeau says that marijuana should be legalized. He's the expert, you should believe him. Legitimate or illegitimate appeal to authority. And what would make it one or the other here? I'm seeing a few heads shaking. People are less hyped about this inference. Yeah? Yeah.
I feel like if they explain why he's the expert or show some more relevance with it, it would make more sense to be a legitimate example.
Okay, so you want more about why he's got the relevant kind of expertise or something like that. What if they said, he's prime minister? Is that enough? That's my explanation of why this might be the relevant kind of expertise. Because he's prime minister. The prime minister's job is to make laws. You should know which laws to make. He's an expert. Yeah.
I mean, he was voted to be the prime minister, so the majority of the people agree with what he says.
That's true.
It's legitimate.
That's true. And I think, yeah, okay, so he was voted in. Now, what would the 37% of people who oppose this legislation say to that? Yeah, I think that's what they say. They say, I didn't vote for him. And certainly it's not the case when Stephen Harper was prime minister. I went, well, Steve's the prime minister. He knows best. Most people voted for him. Gotta believe when he says, that we should do X or Y, he's the expert. I certainly didn't act that way when the Prime Minister was less aligned with my political views. And I'm not sure, I suspect that the 37% of people that disagree with Justin on this one wouldn't act the same way. And I'm not sure that they would be irrational. I mean, you could convince them that they're wrong about this issue, maybe, but not on the basis that he's the Prime Minister and you should believe him on, because he's the expert on this thing, yeah? Yeah. So I would say that this tends to be on the illegitimate side of appeal to authority. This tends to be this is more of the fallacy than a legitimate appeal to authority. And the reason is that there's not an expert consensus. So when we said Justin Trudeau says that a triangle has 180 degrees on the inside, if it was just Justin and everybody else thought it was 190, then that would be a big problem, right? His expertise obviously hasn't given us the consensus of the field or something like that, right? So there should be an expert consensus of some kind if you're going to cite, expert opinion. Similarly, like, it's a really bad move to say, this famous philosopher thinks this, therefore you should too. Because philosophers argue about everything. There's almost never a consensus in philosophy, so just the fact that one guy said it is very poor evidence that you should believe it, because some equally famous other person probably said the opposite, right? And in a situation like that where experts, the most expert you can be, I take it being Prime Minister is the most expert you can be about how laws should be constructed, nonetheless, there's no consensus among them. So appealing to the expertise of the person probably doesn't tell you that they're going to be right necessarily, because a bunch of experts must be wrong when there's no consensus. Yeah? Okay. I think this is an easy one. Justin Trudeau asked the Governor General to dissolve Parliament and issue the writ of election. Well, he's just allowed to do that, right? This is what you do when you want to call an election. They ask the Governor General to dissolve Parliament, and then they run an election. It happens every 4 years. Like, of course he can do that. That's not just an expert opinion, as literally the authority conferred on him by being in that position, right? His position as Prime Minister means that is written into the Constitution that this is something that he's allowed to do, yeah? So if you say, it's okay for Justin Trudeau to dissolve Parliament and issue the writ of election, like, yeah, the fact that he's got this position of authority justifies him in doing that, more or less. I think that's fairly straightforward. Yeah? Okay. So a couple of questions. When you're looking at an appeal to authority, here are the questions that I want you to ask yourself about them. So does the person have the relevant kind of authority? Like Justin Trudeau as a math teacher. He has the relevant kind of authority. Are they likely to be biased or unbiased on the topic? So lots of times, experts are raised to their level of expertise, or they're raised up in society precisely because they're willing to tell people with power what they want to hear. So if you're a consultant for Monsanto, you're an expert. But guess what you're going to say? Monsanto's great. That probably, just the fact that they've got that much power over you probably indicates that you're going to be biased in their favor, and therefore probably your expert opinion isn't worth that much, right? Like, yeah. Okay. Is there an expert consensus, or is the topic a controversial one even among experts? This is the stuff about marijuana being legalized. Like, if there's no expert consensus, the fact that one person is an expert doesn't mean that they're right, right? This should be, I mean, that's fairly straightforward, because if there's 50% of the experts say one thing and 50% say the opposite, citing either one as experts doesn't get you anywhere in the argument, yeah? So there has to be some kind of consensus amongst the experts to be citing their expertise as a reason to believe the consensus. And furthermore, the consensus has to be credible. So 100% of astrology experts believe in astrology, right? They're the experts. They must be right. You know, they're experts on astrology. Yeah? I'm sorry, I don't mean to rag on your beliefs if you really like astrology, but like, this shouldn't be the reason why you believe it, right? Right? So a credible consensus amongst experts, and then the person that you're citing is actually a member of that group, and has the relevant expertise. That's what you really want. Those are the ideal conditions to appeal to authority. And if those conditions are met, what you've done is actually fairly plausible. Right? This is the basis on which all of the scientific facts that I believe are justified. Because some expert who I think has the relevant expertise, who comes from a community where there's some consensus, and furthermore that consensus is credible, told me so. Right? That's why I believe all of the scientific facts that I believe are justified on that basis. So I hope that's a legitimate way of getting information, right? I hope that's a decent way of learning about the world. It's not certain by any means, but it's certainly not just a fallacy to any time you appeal to authority, you're just making an error in argument, right? However, it has to have these conditions met, or at least most of these conditions, or at least somewhat met, or something like that, yeah? You know, the degree to which it's a legitimate appeal to authority is the degree to which these kind of conditions are met. Okay? Okay. How are we doing? Okay, another fun one. This is, apologies for the Latin. Don't use Latin at people, please. Latin is a traditional method of making people feel dumb. I'm giving you the Latin mostly because people will very likely, or it's very possible that people will try to use it to make you feel dumb. So now you're at least inoculated against that happening with these particular Latin words. Yeah, so ad hominem in translated English means literally against the person. So you're making an argument against the person, not against the idea. And it's not a good way of making your argument, right? Discrediting the person is not the same as showing that what they're saying is wrong. Be very careful to distinguish that from saying nasty things or being a jerk. Being a jerk does not make you wrong. Criticism is not necessarily an ad hominem fallacy. Yeah? Saying that somebody has done ill is not the same as attacking the person rather than the idea. The fallacy is to say somebody is wrong because they're a bad person, right? So it's to say, you're a bad person, therefore your argument is invalid. And that's a fallacy, right? So get really clear on this. Please, for the sake of the internet, get really clear on this, because people throw ad hominem around all the time in internet debates, and they use it right about 10% of the time, right? Really what they mean is, you're being uncivil, and I want you to stop, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to say, but you don't need to use Latin to say it, okay? It's perfectly reasonable to request that somebody be more civil in a disagreement, or express that you find them to be obnoxious or something like that. Perfectly reasonable. It's just not the same as this thing. So get clear on this. So some examples. Your multiple arrests for reckless driving make you unsuitable as a bus driver. Is that an error in reasoning, or is that a completely reasonable thing to say? That's a completely reasonable thing to say. Now they're saying something ad hominem, right? They're saying something about the person. They're saying you're a bad driver, but they're giving evidence for that, right? They're not saying you're wrong about whether you're a good driver because you're a bad person. They're saying you're not a good driver because you've had multiple arrests for reckless driving, right? So the object of the conclusion is about the properties of the person, which makes facts about the person relevant to the conclusion, right? So if your conclusion is, you know, you're a bad driver, facts about your driving record are 100% relevant to that conclusion. They are aimed at the person, which is why this is confusing, right? They are directed against the person's credibility as a driver. But critiquing somebody's credibility is not a fallacy in and of itself, especially if you're trying to save school children from fiery death, right? Like, this is a completely appropriate time and place to question somebody's credibility when they're applying for a job to be a driver, right? So I would say that is not an instance of the ad hominem fallacy. It's an argument about the properties of a person. And put fairly nicely, like they're not even being a jerk here. They're just kind of being, this is a fairly neutral way of saying, how are you even applying for this job? Okay. Your analysis of the data is all wrong. You forgot to carry the 2, you jerk. Is that a fallacy? Anyone? No. No. It's just mean. Right? It's rude and uncivil, and I'd recommend you don't act like that. But it's not an error in reasoning, and it's certainly not the ad hominem fallacy. Right? They're saying, you made an error, here's my evidence, you forgot to carry the 2, and then they're saying something mean. But they're not saying you're wrong because you're a jerk. Right? So if you said, your analysis of the data is all wrong because you're a jerk, that would be an ad hominem fallacy. That would be an error in reasoning. That they're a jerk has no bearing on whether they got the analysis right or wrong, right? In this case. Yeah? Okay. You can't trust the prime minister. Anyone in power is only looking out for themselves. Fallacy or not a fallacy? Or to what degree and why? I think it's better to think about this in terms of degrees, right? Is that a reasonable inference or not, and to what degree? You think? Yeah.
Isn't it more like an inductive argument? Because you assume that all people in power look out for themselves.
Yeah.
The prime minister is a person in power.
Yeah.
Therefore, he is not trustable.
Good. Good. Yeah, I think that's right. I think this is reasonably read as just an inductive argument. Probably not a great inductive argument, but nonetheless, it's an argument. And if there's a fallacy here, it would be like hasty generalization or something like that. Like maybe it's not the case that literally all people in power are corrupted by it or are therefore untrustworthy. So it's not a great generalization, but that's a very different problem than saying, you know, you're wrong because you're a jerk. It's not an ad hominem fallacy. Again, it's an argument about the properties of a person. And you're being given a reason. It might not be a great reason. Actually, it might not, no. No, the reason is clearly overstated, but they might be onto something here, right? Like people in power tend to be power hungry. That's not that big of a stretch as a generalization. Anyway. Does that seem right to you? Okay. So, tu quoque. I don't actually know how to say quoque. I mostly just read it rather than hearing it said to me. So don't take my word on it. But this is a certain type of ad hominem that's worth distinguishing from the other types. So this is the area of trying to refute somebody's reasoning by saying that they too are guilty of it. And the lesson here is just because somebody's a hypocrite doesn't make them wrong. Just like somebody being a jerk doesn't make them wrong. I put Richard Pryor up here because he tells this really great story about when his life was going off the rails and he was smoking crack a lot. He said his friends would come over and say, you know, Richard, you're in deep trouble here. This is really, really bad. You've got to get off this stuff. You know, it's ruining your life. But while I'm here, can I have a little bit? No? So the point of that, it's funnier when Richard Pryor says it, obviously, but the point of that, me telling you that, is that his friends were right, that he was in deep trouble. And this is, I mean, he agreed with them after the fact. He says, yeah, I was in deep trouble. I was having a really bad time. I was addicted to crack. That's not a good place to be. So even though they were being hypocrites, they weren't wrong. Yeah? So if somebody offers you a critique of something that you said or you've done, and you reply, well, you do it too, you've committed the tu quoque fallacy, right? Because just because they're a hypocrite doesn't make them wrong. Yeah?
What if someone gives their children vaccine but openly states that vaccines are wrong and you shouldn't give it to your children?
So what if somebody, you know, uses vaccines but says that they're bad for their kid, or that publicly says that vaccines are bad? It's not the fact that they use the vaccine that makes them wrong, right? like that they used the vaccine is not the reason to disbelieve them. It's the mountains of medical evidence that say that vaccines are safe that's the reason to disbelieve them, right? Does that sound right to you?
But I mean, if you're using the vaccine yourself,
Yeah.
and it's implied that either you're doing it for Western interests, or like there's something wrong there.
Right, there is something wrong there. There's certainly something, so if somebody's being a hypocrite, there's certainly something wrong with what they're doing, right? They're saying something that clearly they don't fully believe or something like that, and you're much more convincing if you speak from a place of conviction, of honest, serious conviction. That's when people are most likely to be swayed by what you're saying. So being a hypocrite is really bad rhetorically. Right? You're much less convincing if you're speaking out of both sides of your mouth. But that's a rhetorical point, right? That's about what's convincing, not about what's true or what's rationally justified. So back to the vaccine thing, like, again, I mean, I hope most of you accept that vaccines are a safe and effective way of reducing disease. I'd love to argue with you if you don't. But it's not the fact that somebody has had a vaccination that makes them wrong about vaccines, right? Like that's not why, if somebody presents that argument to me, that's not why I'm going to disbelieve them, right? Yeah, like the medical evidence is why, the medical evidence is the relevant premises for deciding whether vaccines are safe, not what one individual does with their lives. Even if they were vaccinated and were perfectly healthy their whole lives, like that's not the evidence that vaccines are safe. You need much broader evidence than that to establish that. Right? One case study is not sufficient to establish a medical claim like vaccines are safe. You need a bunch of data. Yeah? So, and this generalizes, is the point of this sort of like aside. There's a type of ad hominem fallacy. You're saying you're wrong because you're a hypocrite, which is just a species of you're wrong because you're a bad person. Hypocrite, a bad way of being a bad person. But and like ad hominem, being deficient in some way doesn't make a person wrong. It might make them less convincing, right? So if you want to make the most persuasive case you can, try to avoid being a hypocrite. But like rationally speaking, it doesn't make you wrong. Okay, so we got two more fallacies we'll do quickly, and then we'll do the argument analysis. I'll leave these three questions to you. I'll put these up here because these are the style of questions I'm planning to ask on the second test. So when I said there's a little section where I'm going to ask you questions about fallacies, this is the structure of the questions that I'm going to ask you. These are the actual questions from the exam from last semester. So these are exactly the sort of questions I'm likely to ask you. And you can see I've given you a specific fallacy to think about and then a piece of text and asked you this question about degrees. What degree is this an instance of the fallacy? Why or why not? And why, basically, yeah? So maybe we'll take those up on Tuesday. But right now, let's do these last two fallacies and then try to analyze the argument on the other side of this. Okay, so the balance fallacy. This one comes up a lot. Comes up a lot in news. I mean, this is like, I take it this is the structure of the 24-hour news cycle these days, where people often comment an argument that they thought an argument was one-sided, and they cite this as a problem with the argument. They only considered one side of the argument, which is a relevant thing to consider. Again, with all of these fallacies, there's a version of it that makes sense and a version of it that doesn't make sense, and it might not always be clear which one you're looking at. But the version of this that makes sense is when you presented one side of an argument of which there are two legitimate sides, right? And when there's only one legitimate side, that's an unhelpful, asinine thing to say, yeah? So this picture of this is my favorite picture in the course, by the way. It's a dog getting dish soap poured on its head. So imagine a 6-year-old pouring dish soap on the dog, and the mom comes up and says, "Don't pour dish soap on the dog, he doesn't like it." And the kid says, "Well, you presented one side of the case. What about the pro pouring dish soap on the dog argument?" right? You've only given me the negative side. I think this is one-sided. Let's consider the issue from all sides. Maybe the dog does want dish soap poured on its head, right? Now, what error of reasoning has been committed here? It's the balance fallacy. That would be an instance of the balance fallacy because there's probably not a really good reason to pour dish soap on the dog, right? Probably not. Actually, this picture comes from How to Kill Fleas with Dawn Dish Soap. So if the kid came back with, well, the dog has fleas and you're not doing anything about it, so I thought I'd try to help, then it wouldn't be an instance of the balance fallacy, right? That would be like, no, there are two sides to this. The dog needs dish soap poured on its head. I have good reasons, good, well thought out, well justified reasons. So there are two sides to this argument about whether we should do this to the dog. So I assume that that's usually not going to be the case. Usually, it's like very, very often people will say, well, you've only given me one side of this argument, and there's really only one side of the argument. But notice how hard it's going to be to convince somebody. So, like, how hard it's going to be to convince somebody who thinks that there are two sides to an argument when there's only one. And, right, like if somebody's, if you're talking to the 6-year-old pouring dish soap on the dog, they think that there's another side of the argument, right? And so, again, using the term balance fallacy at somebody is extremely unlikely to move the conversation forward. Because they wouldn't be saying, well, what about the other side of the argument, if they didn't think that there's another side of the argument. What you have to do to show somebody who you think is committing the balance fallacy that they've done so is to show that there's only one legitimate side of the argument. Well, what do you have to do that? You have to go through the whole argument, don't you? Right? So if you accuse somebody of committing the balance fallacy, you have made zero progress in your argument. Nonetheless, it is a fallacy that people can commit. So I want you to know about it, but I just want to, this is one of the prime examples in my mind of like an unhelpful thing to say to somebody. What about the other side of the argument? Like, well, there's only one side of the argument. Prove it. Okay, now we're right back where we started, right? So, yeah. Yeah, I think that's all basically all I have to say about this. Watch for this in the news. They love this. They love the, like, whoa, what about the case for dumping mercury in this stream? What about that? You didn't consider the other side of this argument. And typically very often there's no other side of the argument that any rational, compassionate person would defend. So, balance fallacy. Yeah. Okay. I think that's all I had to say about that one. Fairly straightforward. So, the final one we'll do is the fallacy fallacy. So sometimes people claim that because an argument is poor, because it contains some error, the conclusion must be false. And that's wrong, right? So what we've seen is that there can be arguments that are invalid, but which nonetheless have a true conclusion. Yeah? So just because the argument is bad doesn't mean that the conclusion it's aimed at is wrong. Nonetheless, it does mean that one line of support for the argument has been taken away, right? So you believe things because you've been given reasons to believe them, and if all of the reasons to believe something are undermined, so should your belief in that thing. So, once again, like, whether somebody's committed the fallacy or not is usually going to be up for debate. And but what I want you to understand is what it hangs on, what committing this fallacy or not committing this fallacy hangs on, and mostly it's that, the question is whether you've undermined most or all of the reasons for believing a thing. Okay, so examples. Some of the data used to build climate models comes from old, outdated methods. Their inferences are unfounded. Therefore, global warming is not real. What do you think? So just for reference, it is the case that some of the data used to build climate models comes from really old techniques that probably have some errors in them. That is as far as I know, a fact of the matter. Yeah.
But by their own definition, they're saying some.
Some, right.
So it's not even a good premise to start with.
Not a good premise. Not a good inference. Yeah. So I tend to go on the side of fallacy here, right? They're saying some of the inferences that lead us to believe that global warming is happening are unfounded. Even if that's true, so even if we suppose that that premise is correct, does that entail that it's not happening? No. Right? What it tells us is that essentially that you should, like if they're right, that look, these models are based on faulty data, that means that your credence for the conclusion shouldn't be changed by the model. Doesn't mean it should go up, doesn't mean it should go down. It means that line of argument should no longer be a factor in changing your belief in the conclusion. But there could be other arguments, of course. I take it the best arguments for the reality of global warming come straight out of physics. Like we know which frequencies of light are absorbed when they bounce off the Earth. We know how much energy that includes. We know how much energy is being sort of like released into the atmosphere. It's basic physics that is the bulk of the argument, I take it, not climate models. So even if the climate models were undermined in some important way, you know, like the conclusion is not necessarily false. Yeah? All right. How about, you've forgotten to carry the 2. I don't think your total is correct. Is that a fallacy or a very reasonable thing to say? Yep. That seems right. Yeah. So if that premise is true, look, you forgot to carry the 2. You made an error in your calculations. Like, was there some other reason that you thought that? So what you need to know is there some other reason why you think that total is what it is? Or is that calculation the whole sum of your evidence? So all of my evidence that this is the total comes from these calculations that I did. You made an error in those calculations. Now you shouldn't believe the conclusion anymore, right? Yeah.
But like forgotten to carry it doesn't necessarily mean that the total is incorrect, right? It could be like the 2 is irrelevant for counting the total, which means
Okay.
it still be correct.
Okay, so if it's in like the 8th decimal place and then you round it off to the 2nd, it just gets missed or something like that. Okay. So that would be a context in which this is not a fallacy, or this is, oh, it is a fallacy. Yeah. Yeah, in that context, you'd be saying like, look, your argument was incorrect, but in an inconsequential way, and therefore your total isn't right. So what makes the difference here is whether the error in your argument is one that undermines your conclusion or not. Now, if you had, say, 6 different ways of establishing this total, right? You counted, you took inventory, you did the books, and then you made these calculations. I can't think of 3 other ways. Then making error in one of them isn't enough to undermine all of the evidence that you have for the conclusion. So there are independent reasons to believe this conclusion. Defeating one argument is not cleanly, undermining all of the evidence. And in the case of, I like this example because, there's a lot of numbers. If your total is like 1,300,078, the chances that you would have gotten it right by accident are pretty low. So your only line of reason, suppose that your calculations are the only way that you got this total was adding things up, and it's like in the millions. The chances that you would have gotten it right by accident are pretty low, right? Like you don't just accidentally get the right total. So your prior belief in the conclusion, absent the argument, should be low, right? So what's your belief that it'll be exactly 1,300,027? Well, very low, right? Why that number rather than any other number? So your prior level of credence for the conclusion should be very low, and then the only argument you had for that conclusion is undermined, so your credence should stay very low. Okay? It's not that it should go down exactly, but it should stay low. Yeah? Let's just get a tiny bit meta. You've committed the fallacy, so I think you're wrong. This is, of course, the fallacy. Just for completeness. And again, all the same things apply, right? So this is a good inference, just in case the argument in which you committed the fallacy is the only reason for believing the conclusion. If you had other reasons for believing the conclusion, then this is the fallacy. Okay, I think that is, okay, we'll just do a quick summary of this. So just because an argument is invalid, it does not mean that the conclusion is false necessarily. You can give totally invalid arguments for completely true conclusions. But if you undermine all or most of the evidence for their claim, then reasons to believe it are lacking. So showing an argument that is flawed shows that your degree in the belief in the conclusion should not be changed by it. So this is the crucial thing. You got some degree of belief in the conclusion before you listen to the argument. If you show that an argument for it is invalid, it doesn't mean that your belief in the conclusion should go up or down. It means it should stay the same as it was before you heard the argument. So if you thought it was really implausible, somebody gives you an argument that contains a fallacy, you should continue to think it's really implausible. If you think the conclusion is super plausible, I'm pretty confident this is true, and somebody gives you a garbage argument for it, it shouldn't make your confidence go down. Your confidence should stay exactly where it was before you heard the bad argument. Yeah? Okay. So, and that's the reasonable response to an invalid argument. Say it adds nothing to your stock of beliefs. It shouldn't change what you believed before you heard the argument. That's obviously a different response than saying, well, now I believe this conclusion's false. Right? So if you had no opinion before you heard the argument, you hear the argument, oh, it's an invalid argument. That shouldn't make you say, well, now I'm sure that it's wrong. You should say, well, I don't know anything about this because all I have is this bad argument that tells me nothing. Okay? Questions about any of that stuff? Hopefully this stuff is fairly straightforward. Like I think I should be just giving you names for things that you already knew. Yeah. Okay. Do you want to go through, so there's a couple of examples, but maybe it's better if we just skip these and go straight to the argument analysis, yeah? Let's do that. Okay, I'll leave these up. These are in the slides, and we can take these up later if you want, but right now, I feel like you guys are pretty comfortable with this fallacy stuff so far, yeah? Okay, so let's do this argument analysis. This is from the Toronto Sun. So take 5 minutes, read this over, we'll come back together and first identify the conclusion and maybe, do you want to break it down into premises yourselves this time rather than all doing it together? Yeah, okay, let's do that. So take 10 minutes, check your email, and of course, read this through, find the conclusion, and break it down into premises. We'll come back together and talk about it, okay? And just as a reminder, what I recommend, you read carefully, identify the conclusion carefully, and then push the argument away from yourself. Don't be looking at the specific words on the page anymore. Just try to figure out the main premises. So start by trying to figure out what the main premises leading directly to the conclusion are, and then build up around that. Okay, so you're working backwards from the conclusion. Okay, so 10 minutes. Okay, so it's been 10 minutes. Let's talk about this. Okay, so this is a tricky one. This is genuinely tricky because this person is writing like a normal person where they're not always staying on topic and they're not necessarily just making one clear point. Like I don't think they've made it completely clear what the conclusion of their argument is supposed to be. So what are some of the things that people identified as conclusions of this argument? Yeah.
Two conclusions I could see is either he's trying to say that courses are harmless,
playing golf is good for your health. That would be one conclusion. Anybody else? Yeah. Pesticides should go on golf courses. Another possible conclusion. Did anybody get a different conclusion? Yeah. Good. Yeah. I think any of those would be fine as conclusions for this. Like any of those could legitimately be the conclusion of this argument, which tells you mainly that this person is not a good writer. Because a good writer will let you know very clearly what they're trying to tell you, what they're trying to convince you of. This person, I mean, I guess the other thing I want you to learn here is be careful about submitting letters to the editor because some smarmy college prof's going to probably tear your thing apart. But it's probably a lesson you don't need to learn. But okay, so this person is not a good writer, I'm sorry to say, and it's not obvious what the conclusion is. But we have to proceed. We have to figure out which conclusion we're going to try to prove, or which conclusion we're going to identify as the conclusion of this thing. So a couple things that you might consider when you're trying to identify a conclusion in an unclear argument like this. One of them is to try to maximize. So at every point, you're employing the principle of charity. Okay, so you're trying to make sense of what this person's saying, which sometimes means ignoring a lot of what they're saying. Or not ignoring it exactly, but as classifying it as not really premises. But it can also, so you might have to ignore a whole bunch of it. You might also have to sort of design your conclusion in a way that maximizes how much you can count as a premise. So if you pick a conclusion that makes only one or two sentences into premises, and you pick a different conclusion that makes a lot of the thing into like reasonable premises that could lead to it, probably you should pick the second thing, right? Because you're bringing out more of what they're saying, hopefully. Okay, so broadly, two conclusions that you could focus on here. I think the first sentence here is a really plausible conclusion. Pesticides on golf courses don't cause cancer. But you might find that there's a broader conclusion that includes more of what they're saying, which is something like golf is a safe and healthy activity. Does that make sense? So if pesticides on golf courses don't cause cancer, that could then be a premise that leads to golf is safe and healthy. Yeah? Okay, so let's start from that. Let's start with that as our conclusion. Golf is safe and healthy. Maybe just healthy, because for something to be healthy, it has to also be safe, yeah? Okay, so golf is healthy. Again, putting a premium on simplicity here is a really good strategy. You make things easier for yourself in terms of parsing, understanding, and getting to the heart of the argument, the more simply you can phrase things. Yeah? Something can be healthy but not safe. Can you give an example?
Well, like for example, when we're training soccer, there's this particular type of training that's called an high intensity. It's not exactly safe, whereas sentence are not really good.
I would say that it's not healthy then. If it's liable to cause injuries, yeah, maybe. Okay, I take your point. Let's leave that aside. Let's leave aside the possibility of non-safe healthy things. Yeah, high intensity interval training, is that what you're talking about? Yeah. I think sports are bizarrely dangerous. I can't understand why people do it. They seem so dangerous to me. Anyway, that's just my personal weirdness. Okay, so let's go with golf is healthy, yeah, as our main conclusion. Now, I said already that the first sentence could be a premise for that. So pesticides on golf courses don't cause cancer. Yeah? So having identified that, having identified this as the conclusion and this is one of the premises leading to the conclusion, a bunch of the sentences in this should snap into place for you now, right? As evidence for P1, right? So there's a bunch of stuff that leads to P1, which then leads to the conclusion, yeah? Okay, is there any other premise that you think would lead directly to this conclusion? You might have to, like there's bits in here that suggest it. You might have to make it a little more explicit than the writer did in the text, but like. Yeah, is there anything else that would lead directly to the conclusion? So what we're doing is starting from our conclusion and working backwards to the premises that would lead directly to it so that we can then have everything else sort of snap into place. Anything else? Yeah.
Clean and safe golf courses make golf healthy?
Yeah. So the premise is golf courses are clean and safe or something like that?
Yeah, so should it be?
Yeah. So again, the only thing I'm worried about with that, like that makes sense to me, but I would probably, well, what we could do is say instead of this, golf courses are clean and safe, or something like that, and then this would be evidence for that, something like that. For the sake of simplicity, because I don't think that there are any other reasons given to think that golf courses are clean and safe, they're just focusing on the pesticide issues, so maybe just leave it with that. Yeah. The only reason you would do that is just for the sake of simplicity. Try to get the compact representation of the argument. What I was thinking was just like golf is healthy. Yeah.
Honestly, I don't really understand like through this argument. It just looks like his conclusion is for pesticides not causing cancer. Like, although yeah, you can come up with golf is healthy, but like at the end of the day, he's still saying he's trying to prove that pesticides on golf is good for us.
Yeah. So
That's just a small part of it where he says that it's healthy because of this. I mean,
that's, you know what, I think that's a very reasonable way of parsing this. So we could say instead of golf is healthy, the conclusion might just be pesticides, just P1 pesticides in golf courses don't cause cancer. So that's, conclusion here is just P1. And then, whatever arguments are mounted for this are the whole argument for you. I think that you can scrape up a little more, like we're really digging to find good arguments. And I don't think this is a good argument, obviously. We're sort of scraping to find more structure in this argument, but I think you can. I think you can say something like P2, golf is healthy, generally speaking, right? Playing golf is healthy, right? You're in the sun, you're walking around, and so the evidence that I would use to defend that as part of the argument are sentences like, a game with so many benefits for young and old. That's suggested to me. Like he's mentioned the health benefits of golf. In the final sentence, golf lovers can continue to enjoy well-kept courses with the knowledge that the game is good for their health and communities. Like those strike me as suggesting that his argument is, or his or her argument is aimed at something broader than just the cancer thing. But there's legitimate room for disagreement here. If you say like, no, I just don't think that that's what this is about, I think you could be making a reasonable, like you're saying something quite reasonable. So, okay, so let's leave that aside. And I think this is the only other premise that's offered. If this is the conclusion, these are really the only two main premises, right? There's nothing else, there's no other big ideas being offered here, right? Everything else is evidence for one or the other, or just sort of an aside. Yeah?
I mean, pesticides used in golf courses aren't harmful. That's got to be the main point.
Well, is that captured by don't cause cancer? Is there some other kind of harm that's considered, I guess is the question. Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say something unrelated.
Oh, okay, so yeah.
Yeah, but like you say, golf course, like any management base, green space, require protection against insects, weeds, and diseases from time to time.
Yeah.
That basically says that we need pesticides for those courses to be safe. That's why pesticides are needed for golf courses to be safe.
Yeah, I think that's more just explanation of why we end up with pesticides rather than so I would have classified that as explanation and context rather than part of the argument. There's quite a bit of that in here. So yeah.
So also, wouldn't P2 just make it a circular argument?
Well, yeah. Okay, so yeah, that's a good point. We should rephrase that. Yeah. The physical activity involved in golf is healthy. Would that help? Because so the physical action of golf might be healthy, but if they're using horrible pesticides, then in total, that's the distinction I think would be worth making here. So, the game of golf itself is healthy. Good spot there. Good. Yep.
Can we just make it that golf involves physical activities and a missing premise that says physical activities are healthy?
You could. Yeah. Do we need to?
Like, I'm just asking, is it?
Oh yeah. I mean, so you could do that. So, but we're kind of reconstructing this already from little bits and pieces. So I don't know. Yeah. I'm willing to give up on this whole line of like secondary reasoning here. Like this might not be the point of this argument. Let's lay out the reasons for P1 and just see where that gets us, okay? So like I take it that we've got the conclusion and we've clearly got P1 leading directly to the conclusion. Pesticides in golf courses don't cause cancer, therefore golf is healthy. I think that's okay. Like you could add missing premises to make the relationship a little tighter, but maybe you don't need to. So what was offered as reasons for P1? Yeah.
I think it's a dependent relation with it's regulated by Health Canada.
Yep.
And then Health Canada's priority is safety, and the fact that the quote that they had was
Yeah, so
pesticide ownership for use in Canada only if the level of exposure to Canadians does not cause harmful effects.
okay. Yep.
All three.
So there's a three-part relation being offered between Health Canada regulates these things, their priority is safety, and they say it's safe. I wonder if we need that middle one. I wonder if we need that their priority is health. Because
I mean, if their priority is health, then
does that mean we should believe them?
no, but then that's why we're providing the fact where they say that the only level of exposure.
That's right. I think that's why it's being offered as a reason, but that's sort of explanation rather than argument, right? So, like, Health Canada's priority is definitely health, but that doesn't make them right? Or it doesn't act as a reason to believe that pesticides don't cause cancer. Right? It's more that they said it, right? Is being offered. Yeah.
I'm kind of confused, but how does P1 link to golf being healthy?
Well, so one reason that you might think that golf is unhealthy is that pesticides on golf courses cause cancer. Yeah. Yeah.
Then the premise be that it's like managed well because they don't always use pesticides, so mitigated pesticides.
Yeah. So pesticides on golf courses don't cause cancer. Pesticides are not always used, so even if they did cause cancer, they're not always present. Something like that. Yeah. So that would make sense. So that's good. So we're bringing in more of this stuff about golf courses practice integrated pest management. So good. So that would be. So golf courses don't always use pesticides. Yeah. Maybe a quick way of saying that. Don't. I think that actually gets to be an independent reason to believe golf is healthy, assuming that you can connect, if you can connect P1 directly, you can probably connect P3 directly to the conclusion, yeah? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Could we add up this improvise that we should believe health cannot pesticides because it's the crop because pesticides under safety?
Yeah, I guess we could. Yeah, we could. Okay, so let's get the reasons for P1 up here then. So pesticides on golf courses don't cause cancer. Yep.
But then if you still play golf on like a course that has pesticides, right? Isn't it still healthy for you? Golf itself is a sport.
So sure. I mean, so I take it that this is supposed to be the reason that we distinguished the game of golf itself from the broad activity of golf was that in this one you're just talking about the physical movements that you're making, and in this one you're talking about the whole environment or something like that. Yeah. So if it's the case that all golf is played on courses that have pesticides that are bad for you, then playing golf in general is not going to be healthy. It'll be detrimental to your health in general, assuming that they always use pesticides. So, but yeah, so we could be more precise about this conclusion. Yeah.
Then I think there are two different arguments for two different conclusions. One being that golf is healthy for you, and another one being that their golf courses are healthy.
Yeah. Can't you integrate those though? Can't you say like, look, here's an argument that the basic physical activity of golf is good for you. Here's another argument that says the environment is not dangerous. These combine to overall conclusion that golf is okay for you. Yeah. I think those could be meaningfully kind of combined into one overall argument. It's really hard to say in this case. Like this is really not a good, well-written argument. So, but I think that's it. So I do think that there's P2, the game of golf itself is healthy. P1 and P3 all lead directly to the conclusion, and then we're given some reasons for P1, right? So let's just say, let's summarize. I feel the room getting restless, so I'm gonna do this quickly. I hope you don't mind. I've done violence to your three-part dependent relation, but Health Canada says pesticides are safe, and that would be a reason to believe P1. Yeah?
But I think that P3 is also reason to be P1 because, like, just because golf courses don't always use pesticides doesn't mean nothing. That it's healthy. I mean, if they don't use pesticides all the time, then maybe it's not a cause of cancer. Like, maybe that decreases, like, if you use it a lot. If you say that using a lot of pesticides
I see.
cause cancer.
I see. Okay.
If you don't use it a lot, therefore it won't cause cancer.
So this would be something like the amount and type of pesticides used on golf courses doesn't cause cancer or something like that.
Like a dependent, saying that, you know what, if you don't, like, using limited amount of pesticide is regulated or whatever, safe or something, then, and the fact that they don't use pesticides always guarantees that golf is healthy. But like, just like that, I don't think, how would someone believe that just because golf courses don't use it always?
Well, so there's two things here, right? I do think that there's two independent reasons being given here, right? So you say substance X isn't dangerous, and furthermore, we don't always use substance X. I take it that those are two independent reasons to believe that you're not in danger from substance X, right? So, that's, if either one of those true, then they're relevant to the conclusion. So if I say, like plutonium is dangerous, but we don't use it, that's a reason to believe that you're not in danger. If we say plutonium's not dangerous, so you're not in danger, that would be an independent reason. And if both of those are true, like plutonium is not dangerous, and furthermore we don't use it very much, you've got two independent reasons to believe that you're not in danger, I would say. That's why I would rank P3 and P1 as independent reasons to believe the conclusion. Yeah.
For premise 3, like I kind of think that golf courses, like it's a
Yeah.
So that means that there's like thought put into like the maintaining of the phosphorus, which makes it healthy. So it's not like just because the pesticides aren't harmful, they still aren't using them like carelessly. That makes sense. Like it's a healthy environment.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess so. So that it's a managed space, I'm not sure if I see why that's relevant. So it could be the case that the space is highly managed, but it's managed in a way that's really bad for you. So that it's managed doesn't seem to be the important thing there, right? So, or that they put thought into it doesn't seem to be the important thing there. Back when we used to spray everything with DDT, which is extremely toxic, insect repellents, you know, a highly managed space would be blasted with these very toxic chemicals to make it highly managed, but it was nonetheless really bad for people. So that it's managed doesn't seem to be the important thing. It's that it's managed in a way that reduces the amount of pesticides that you use. I take it that that's what's important in this context. Hi. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, we got 3 minutes left. Let's call it a day. I think you guys are making excellent points here, and that you really could be other ways of breaking this down. So good work, everyone.